In the video I did the other day about ground schemes in a vintage Fender, I realized I overlooked one thing that's very common that people encounter, especially in kit builds or when they get a clone build of an amp. It's the use of a bus bar or a bus wire across the back of the pots. And it's very, very common, and people think it's the right way to do things, and it's not. I have shown in great detail in the video on Marshall ground schemes why a bus wire across the back of the pots creates a higher noise floor, creates eddy currents, ground loops. It's to be avoided. The link to that video is in the description below, as is the previous video on Fender ground schemes. But what do you do if you have, say, a new aluminum chassis that you can't solder to, or you have a steel chassis but you don't want to solder to it, you want to use a hardware ground connection with a ground lug and a machine screw and nuts? Well, you can still do that, and in that case, a bus wire can be really great. Now, this is just a little bit of 20-gauge bus wire that I had lying handy. I'm using for the demonstration here on this 65 Super Reverb. In practice, I would use either a 12 or 14-gauge bus wire, which is much thicker, or more likely what I typically do is I take two 18-gauge bus wires and I put them in a drill and tightly twist them together. So I end up with a very thick, very rigid piece of wire that's still flexible as I need it to be, but it accepts solder much better than, say, a 12-gauge, because it takes a long time to heat up a 12-gauge to get a good joint. Anyway, the approach that you would take would be to have a long piece of bus wire, say from this pot to this pot, and then it would be connected, say you have a wire from the ground connection here to here, and from this resistor we're going to here, and this would go to here, and this would go to here, and this would go to here. And any connections on the board, say this cathode, would also go to here. A filter cap could go to there. A negative feedback connection could go to there in a circuit with a presence pot. But you would have it about here, so it's just behind everything, and everything's connected to it, and all the little wires going to it, and the resistors going to it support its weight. And then, and this is crucial, at only one end would it connect to the chassis. And that's where you'd have a ground lug with a screw. You would not want to have any other connection to chassis ground throughout this entire run, because if you did the same thing at the other end, and you had a connection here and a connection here, then you've created the loop. So you want it to be like that. Now, on a Fender like this, you could just have one really long bus wire across the back of all the pots for both channels like this. And it can connect to ground here or connect to ground here. Either of those is fine. It's by an input jack. But the problem with doing it that way is that if you ever need to change these input jacks, it's very difficult because they're in the way. So I would suggest in a Fender, if you're building one, is to have one bus wire for all the pots to the left, going to ground at the chassis right there. You could still change out these input jacks, and the input jacks make their own connection to the chassis due to the way that they're built. You don't have to worry about connecting those to the bus wire. And then I'd have another smaller bus wire over here for all these pots in the normal channel, also going to chassis here. So you would have two chassis connections in the entire part here. It's only two holes to drill, two ground lugs, et cetera, and then you have a very neat, reliable thing. So it's fine to use a bus bar like this, but you only want to have the chassis connection at one end. Now, what some other people do is that they will have a bus wire going along the entire back of the board, and all the board grounds are made to that point, and you'd have wires going from there to the various pots and such. Or you can just have the pots connected to the shell of the pot itself like that. So that would be a ground at the pot, but all the board stuff would be going to a bus wire mounted above or behind the main board, as long as there's only one connection to chassis from that bus bar, and preferably by one of the input jacks in a Marshall right down here at the point where all the input jacks come in, then that is fine as well. So I'm not saying a bus wire is a bad idea, but the way it's usually done, just across the back of the pots, can be a terrible idea. And for more information on that, you can see it in the video on ground schemes in a Marshall, and I've got many videos up on the channel showing the before and after of changing the ground scheme in a Marshall and the dramatic reduction in buzz and hiss and background noise. And you'll notice in the title that I spelled it bus wire like B-U-S. B-U-S-S is also acceptable. Both are the same term. Both are acceptable. I don't know if it's a England versus America thing or what, but you can call it either a bus or a bus. Thanks for watching.